Okay, so hi everyone, Amichai here. Today, finally, we're going back to our code base and starting to write some code again. If you're like me and you much prefer coding, then you're going to enjoy this one and the upcoming videos. We're basically going to write a ton of code implementing much of the theory that we talked about up until now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the domain project and inside the common folder, create a new folder. Let's call it models. And inside here, what I'm going to do is create the base classes for the different domain objects that we're going to have later. So for the value object, for the aggregate root, and for the entity. So let's start with the value object. So let's create here a new file. Let's call it value object. Okay, and what we're going to have over here is basically the base class that all the value objects in our project will inherit from. Now, if you remember, value objects are considered equal if their values are the same. So for that we have some inspiration, let's just put over here some class that we can use for reference, just for us to have something for reference while we're implementing. So let's say we have here the price value object. Let's say here that we have the amount. Yes, and we have the currency, and we have a constructor that receives both of them and initializes it. Now, two price objects are considered equal if they have the same values in these two properties. So the way this looks from the value object base class perspective, let's create it over here. So we have our public abstract class value object. Okay, and what we're going to have over here is public abstract enumeral of object, and let's call this, yes, get equality components. And basically what this is a method that each one of the value objects in our code base will have to implement. So let's say value object, and the way each one of the derived value objects is going to use this method is basically returning the properties in a defined order. So let's say, for example, you'll return amount and then the currency. Okay, now we're going to override the equals method in the base class. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to call the get equality components on the two objects and make sure that they return the same value. That way we're comparing the property values. So let's override our equal methods. So let's say override, and let's start with equals. And basically what we want to do over here is we want to say if the object, yes, let's say if the object is null, or that the type of the object, if the types aren't equal, then we want to return false. Otherwise, let's cast it to a value object. And then this is also the right thing. Let's just put this on a blue line. Okay, so again, what we have here is basically over here, we're making sure that the two objects are from the same type. Then we're casting it to a value object, that the value object has this method over here that will return the properties in a specific order. Then over here, we basically check the values of the properties in both of the objects. If it's the same, then it's equal. If it's not, then it's not equal. Next, let's move on to overriding the equals and not equals operators. Okay, so over here, we're going to have public static bool operator equals, and we're going to have value object left, value object right. And simply what we're going to do over here is call our equals method that we already defined. So we can basically say return equals, pass it left and right. Let's also add the not equals, which is going to be not equals. The next thing we want to do is override the get hashcode method because we want two value objects with the same property values to return the same hashcode. So for that, let's say override, and let's say the get hashcode, yes. And what we're going to have over here is basically each one of the properties we're going to call its get hashcode, and then we're going to do XOR between them and return that value. So let's say get equality components, yes, almost. And over here, we're going to say if the X is not null, get its hashcode, otherwise return 0. And then let's simply do XOR between them. So let's say aggregate, and yes, like so. So all we did is we overrode what we need for the two value objects to be equal and have the same hashcode when they have the same property values. Okay, another thing we might want to do is override the equatable interface with passing it the value object, and then we can implement the method that they want us to implement, which is equals, and here we can simply do the same thing that we did before as so. Now, what you're actually going to do is simply go online, search for value object base class, and download the first one that you see This is written more or less the same in all the implementations. So this is just for us to drive the points home, but you definitely don't need to remember this or write this from scratch every time that you need a value object. Okay, so we got rid of this. We have the value object. Now let's move on to the entity. What we want over here is similar to the value object. Luckily, it's a bit less code. And what we want to do is basically say that two entities are equal only when their ID is equal. So almost, let's say public abstract class entity. Each one of the entities is going to have some ID, which is a TID. And we want to say that the TID is not null. Let's say not null. Okay, what we're going to have over here is our ID. So yes, like this, but we're not going to need this because we're going to set it in the constructor. So let's say protected, and let's say entity. This receives the ID and sets it like this. Now what we want to do is we want to say that two entities are equal if their ID is equal. So again, let's override the equals method, and let's say that this returns true only when the other entity is from the same type and that their IDs are equal. So yes. Next thing we want to do is override the equals and not equals operators like GitHub Copilot suggested. So yes, let's also override the not equals, right? So same drill. This is returns true when they don't equal. And also over here, what we might want to do is we might want to implement the IEquatable interface. So IEquatable, and let's pass it entity of TID, like so. Let's implement the interface. And what we want to do over here is basically the same thing. So return, and let's let it complete what we want. Yes. And last but not least is overriding the get hash code. So this is what we want. Again, we want two entities to return the same hash code if their ID is the same. That's it for now. We still haven't learned about domain events and other things that we're going to need in this base class. So for now, this is enough for this stage. The next thing we want to do is create the aggregate root. So let's say aggregate root. What we want over here is almost, let's get rid of the unneeded parts and let's explain it, right? So basically, the aggregate root is also an entity. It's sort of like a wrapper around the entity. And all we're doing is we're calling the base class. Okay, so this is our aggregate root alongside our entity and our value object. Now, when we start implementing our aggregates, our entities, all we need to do is derive from the correct base class, and we're going to have the equality, the get hash code, whatever we need for it to follow the domain-driven design principles that we talked about. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new if you are doing this for the first time. If not, then let me know how this is compared to the way you do it in your company or in your project. So that's it. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.